All right, if you will turn to Judges chapter 6, and hopefully we're going to try and finish out the chapter tonight. I don't know if we'll get there, but we're going to try. So let me just read the first few verses here just to get us in tune where we are. We kind of left off on verse 12 last week. So we'll start in verse 13. We'll just probably go down to verse 19 or so. But Gideon said to him, O Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles which our fathers told us about? Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. Then the Lord turned to him and said, Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hands of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? So he said to him, O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And the Lord said to him, Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man. Then he said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talk with me. Do not depart from here. I will pray until I come to you and bring out my offering and set it before you. And he said, I will wait until you come back. So Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread from the ephah of flour. The meat he put in the basket, and he put the broth in a pot, and he brought them out to him underneath the terebinth tree and presented it to them. Then the angel of God said to him, Take the meat and unleavened bread and lay them on this rock and pour out the broth. And so he did. And then the angel of the Lord poured out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and the fire rose up out of the rock and consumed the meat and unleavened bread. And the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. All right, so we're back to Gideon again. I guess we finished around 13 last week. Again, last week we looked at, kind of talked about his call for service, and really this is the second part of that. You'll see in your slide, or the slides it's up there, you don't see it on there, but you see the period for the judges, just kind of, we already know that a little bit. And then I added a kind of a slide here that gives us some perspective of where we're at in the book of Judges right now, and that's the Judges timeline there. We see we're in the fifth judge, which is Gideon, that we're at. We've got a few more to go, so you see the timeline there. And then the next we see, of course, the cycle of sin. And we've talked about this several times, and we go over this every single time. Remember that in Israel there's always seems to be this period of silence where nobody is talking or nobody is saying anything, nothing is going on. As a result of that silence, nothing's happening with the Lord or anything, and because of that, Israel falls into sin. And then because of their sin, they fall into servitude under someone, whoever that is. In this case, it's the Midianites and the Amalekites, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And then we come into a time of supplication, this time where Israel then cries out. They then lift up a judge, someone who's going to save or bring deliverance to Israel. And as a result, then it falls back into silence. And again, we know that because when we look at the scriptures, it always says that, and the Lord was quiet for 40 years, or there was a time there was rest in Israel for 40 years. And it seemed like during that time there was always an issue or problem. Go ahead, Brian. Brief review, of course, Gideon faced the Midianites and the Amalekites. They continued to always be a problem for Israel. The Amalekites were descendants of Esau, Jacob's twin brother, and you can get that in Genesis as well. And then according to Genesis, the Midianites were the descendant of Midian, who was the son of Abram and his wife Keturah after Sarah's death. And so we see the problem that these continue to cause. And again, these were issues that Israel should have been dealing with. They should have gotten rid of them, yet they never did. And because they never did, because of that, they continued to plague Israel and cause them problems. And so then last week we spent a lot of time talking about Gideon's calling, and we said really that it was an unlikely calling. And here, a couple of things we get out of today's lesson, or at least we should see out of today's lesson, is a familiar pattern of Moses-like. God chooses the weak and unexpected as his means of deliverance. We'll see these, we'll get a chance, and we're going to look at some of the struggles here in just a minute. that Gideon had. And he had several struggles that he had throughout this time as he's being called to do what he's supposed to do. And because of that, he makes excuses. And those excuses play out before God and before the angel. And so we see these things going on. Then the second thing I have there is God reassures with his most potent promise, I will be with you. And this is, in this section of Scripture here, that's one thing that the Lord constantly repeats to Gideon. He constantly says, listen, I'm going to be with you. I will be with you. How do you know what's going to happen or what's going to go on? I will be with you. And I think that part of that goes back to what happens in verse 13, where he says where Gideon is saying to him, you know, did the Lord not bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us in the hands of the Midianites. Now, obviously, what Gideon doesn't understand, that God is sovereign and control and has put them back into the hands of the Midianites for a reason, so that he can bring up a deliverer, so they can bring somebody up to deliver them out of it, so they turn back to God again. Again, this is within his providential hand to do this. And so that's what Gideon doesn't get. But through this whole time now, through really the last part of this chapter, the one thing that we see totally is that he continues to say to him, listen, I'm going to be with you. You know, I will be there for you. I'll be with you. And we know that essentially that Gideon is utterly inadequate to carry out what he's going to be asked to do. And so we're going to talk, the next one. But yet we know here in verse 12 what it said, that the Lord is with you, the mighty warrior. And even though we see, and it's funny because in verse 12 he calls him this mighty warrior, yet, and we see one of Israel's greatest leaders here. We'll kind of get to that as we continue to finish out through Gideon, because we got a lot more to go with him as we get into chapter 7 and 8 a little bit too, is that he faced some struggles. And that even though he's this mighty warrior, even though he's this great leader of Israel, there are some things that he faced. And I put down 4, you can go ahead and hit that, Brian. 4 things that he faced. Go ahead. The first one is trust. He didn't trust in God. You see that his inadequacy and everything, or that his trust, that he didn't have it. And that's really in verse 13 there, where he says, "Oh Lord, if my Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? You know, you did all these things to save our fathers. You did all this kind of stuff, but yet where are you now?" And again, we've kind of beat that to death to understand what he's trying to say to us. The second thing that we see there then is that his inferiority in verse 15, and we're going to get into these a little bit more as we go through it here. And he said to him, "O Lord, O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and therefore I am the least of my father's house." So he's already making excuses, and again, that's reminiscent of who? Of Moses. And we'll talk about that in here in a second. We see avoidance. Look at 6:17 through 22. So here's the angel of the Lord coming to him, and instead of just taking him at his word, he's trying to, I think, at least for me, I think what he's trying to do here is stay off the situation. Let's see if I can give him some hoops to jump through. Now, I think also he wants to make sure that this guy is from the Lord, and I think that's good that he's doing that, to make sure that this is actually from the Lord and not from something else. But he really is putting this off as long as he can. We see some avoidance on him. And then the final thing is that we see in verse 27, if you look down to 6:27, where he says, "So Gideon took 10 men with him from among his servants, did as the Lord said, but because he feared his father's household and the men of the city too much to do it by day, he did it by night." And again, we'll look at this as he destroys the altars of Baal and the Ashtaroth and things like that. So we'll talk about that in a second. But we really see that Gideon here struggles with these things. And the interesting thing here is all of these things here, I think, are in our Christian life too as well. You know, I think at times, sometimes we don't trust God to deliver us or to pull us out of those situations that we're in. And yet God gives us promises that he will deliver us from those things. I think sometimes we feel inferior. I don't have as much Bible knowledge as the guy next to me. I don't know as much as they know. I can't do all these things that they can do. Like I can't build like Bill builds. I wish I could build like Bill builds. Well, he was an engineer, so he should be able to build a little bit. But the thing about it is, I don't have that skill set. I can't do that. Now, that doesn't make me, well, it does make me a little jealous of Bill, but I do feel inferior to him because of that a little bit. But see, it's those kind of things that we get in our head, that understanding that if we understand that each of us are part of the Christian body and each of us has a role within that body. And Bill plays the hands a lot because he has the ability to do that. And yet, sometimes we're called to do different things. Sometimes I got to be the toe or the foot or, whatever to do certain things because that's what God has called me to do at that point in time. So a lot of times we let that inferiority come between us and our service at times. The other thing is I think we avoid things a lot of times. We avoid it. We don't want to deal with it. We want to avoid what maybe God is calling us to do at the time. And so we put all kinds of obstacles in the way. Listen, Pastor, I can't do that because of this. I'm afraid to do that, or I'm afraid to do something because of that. I'm afraid to try this thing because of this. And so when we avoid those kind of things, what happens is that nothing ever gets done for the cause of Christ. And so we've got to make sure, and obviously it comes down to witnessing. I mean, a lot of us avoid witnessing because we put it off because, well, somebody else better who will be a more silver-tongued devil than I will come along and speak to that person, and I don't really want to say anything to him. So we avoid things. And then finally we have a fear. We're fearful of what happens. We're afraid a lot of times. And so because of our fear, it holds us back. And it really holds us back in terms of our service to Christ. All right, let's look at the first one here that it is. I know we've already looked at it a little bit, but here, the trust issue. Gideon's problem was not a lack of knowledge. He knew well what God had done. His problem was a lack of faith and obedience. Gideon's faith was not consistent. We see that as he struggles through this narrative here for us. He really struggles to get us to this point of leading himself into having a true sense of faith and having a true sense of what he's supposed to do. And then we see Gideon, because he did not trust in the assurance of God's word, was doubtful and uncertain and skeptical as to whether God's promises would ever come true. You see, and again, this too happens to us at times. As Christians, this comes to us. We know what God's promises are. We have God's word right before us all the time. We're always reading those promises. If you're into daily study at all, you know what His promises are, and yet are they ever going to come true? Are they ever going to happen for us? And so as a result, we have to understand and why we've got to make sure that we put our trust in Him. The second thing we hear is that God is the inferiority. As God commands come for Gideon to assume leadership, Gideon saw no qualifications for accepting the role that he felt unqualified. And here's the thing. This is where I see he's kind of like a Moses-like guy. And in Judges, he has a significant role because we see him in 6, 7, and 8. So Gideon has a significant role in the book of Judges here, as we know that Moses had a significant role. And what was Moses? Always making excuses why he couldn't do what the Lord wanted him to do. Listen, God, I'm not that great. I don't have that great a speech. I can't speak that well. I can't do this. I can't do that. There's somebody else you could probably send, not me. So we see this Moses-like kind of thing. And in one of the commentators that I use, he says this: the statement has a history. It seems to be Yahweh's trump card placed down in front of an unwilling or hesitant servant. If in the face of Moses' resistance, Yahweh had insisted, "But I will be with you," in Exodus 3:12. See, that's what he's going to constantly say to Gideon, and that's what he constantly said to Moses. And certainly we see that as Moses went through leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, God was always with him. God was always there for him. And the commentator goes on and says this: after Moses' death had apparently left a giant hole in Israel's leadership, Yahweh had reassured Joshua as I have been with Moses, I will be with you, in Joshua 1:5. And in all the dilemmas, quandaries, and crises that ever been in the word of the covenant God to his servants. Genesis 28:15, Genesis 46:4, Deuteronomy 21, Psalm 23:4, Isaiah 41:8 through 10, Isaiah 43:2 and verse 5, and then Matthew 28:20 and Acts 18:9 through 10. We see that what? That God is always there with us. That he is the one always there with us. And it's important for us to understand that he is the one who's always going to constantly be there, for us. And so we have to know that it's his word that has the authority for us, and the word's going to do things. So Gideon kept asking questions, why me? How can I do that? I am sure Gideon was convinced God was making a big mistake. And in verse 15 there, where he says all this, where he's going back and saying all these things, listen to me. You can see Gideon saying this. How can I save Israel? How can I do this? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh. So my little family is the weakest one in Manasseh. And I'm the least in my father's house. Yet God always takes the weakest and makes them the strongest. The first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. You see, what was David? David wasn't the first in his household, was he? He was the last. And so what? And yet out of David came Jesus Christ, came the lineage of Jesus Christ. You see, came that ruling authority that would always be over us. And then what do we see here? The last thing in inferiority there. He was confident that he could not do the job of leading Israel. So his inferiority came shining through all the time. It constantly was shining through where he was at. And so then we see that the next thing that we see is his avoidance. He needed an authenticating sign. The consuming of the offering meal was a sign of Yahweh's favor in the presence of with Gideon. Gideon responded with a cry of anguish and the fear that his life led to the worship of Yahweh, who granted him peace. You see, he wants to avoid this thing altogether. And I even think, to a certain extent, when we get back to the fleece, what's he constantly do with the fleece? It's a constant thing. Okay, God, give me a sign. Okay, God gives him a sign. Well, God, you did it on that side. Now, I just want to make sure that what's going on is happening. So let's turn that over and try this again. God, hold on one more time. Just one more time. Let's try it when you get it, however it says in there, they get completely soaked now and leave the ground around it dry or whatever. This dialogue between God and Gideon goes back and forth. And we see that he's always trying to just avoid what is happening here. There seems to be an avoidance about Gideon and what he's trying to do. And so with that, it's like holding it off, and yet God is the one who is constantly there for him and bringing him forward. And then finally, in this section here, the fear that happens. So we see this fear that he has. The brave, courageous leader was as scared to death as anybody. He was scared. We know what he's going to be. We know what he's going to turn out to, yet these fears had to be subsided. And it had to be what? It had to be God constantly saying, listen, I surely will be with you. Look at verse 16 in the thing. What's he say? And we know he said this before in these verses. He says what? And the Lord said to him, surely I will be with you and defeat the Midianites as one man. And look at verse 17. Then I found favor in your sight. Then show me a sign if it is you that's talking to me. And so now he's asking, he's putting this avoidance off here. He knew that his actions would alienate his friends and relatives. We're going to get to that in just a second because of what he's being called to do. And as he feared the Midianites, as he faced the Midianites, he was fearful. We know that. We see that. But he was willing to serve God because he was willing in service. His fear was overcome. And really, that's what it did. He finally overcame his fear. He finally really did this. Now, let's get the picture of where we're at here with Gideon before we get into this next phase here of destroying sin. Gideon comes upon the angel. The angel comes with him and tells him that you're going to be a mighty man of valor. He gives them this saying that, listen, you're going to deliver Israel out of this time. he goes through his thing saying, well, listen, God, I'm just not good enough. I'm fearful. I don't want to trust in you. All these kind of things, and he looks for the avoidance. He goes through all this stuff. And then we get over to this time of what the angel does with with essentially his meal. Now, it's interesting. One thing that is, as he's going to prepare this meal for the angel that the angel's about ready to destroy here, it's just kind of nonchalant. This takes time to do this. Okay? It's not like in verse 19 there where it says, so Gideon went and prepared the young goat and unleavened bread. See, he didn't just run down to Kroger's and say, hey, can I get the goat? You know, it's already butchered up for him. Everything's taken care of. He doesn't have to worry about anything. He doesn't just able to run down to do it. He's got to go prepare this thing. So it's going to take time for him to do that. You know, and so as he's putting time to do that, also as it continues, he does all this thing. And then, of course, what happens here with the angel then, he puts him to this place of touches the meat, and then, of course, what happens in verse 21, B, we see the fire, and then in verse 21C, we see the disappearance. And then look at verse 22, because now Gideon perceives that he was the angel of the Lord. And so Gideon, alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel in the face of the Lord. See, Gideon, here, this is, if you will, this is the paradox for Gideon. Gideon was trying to get assurance to make sure that this was God while trying to put this off and avoiding it a little bit. But yet what happens here? Well, looking at where it says there, because for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. It then gives him what? It actually instills terror and fear in him about this. You know, the Lord said, "In peace, do not fear." So, and what that tells us in verse 23 is that he had to be fearful. You know, he's telling him not to fear, but he had to be fearful. So so in verse 24, Gideon built an altar to the Lord and called it the Lord is peace, and to this day it still is an Ophrah of the whatever. I pronounced that thing 50 times and I can't pronounce it now. So now it came to pass, look at verse 25. So it came to pass the same night that the Lord took him, take your father's bull, and the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it, and build an altar to, and of course go into verse 26 here where it talks about going and build an altar to the Lord. Now what do we see here? What's the next thing? What do we say? Israel is in sin. Go all the way back to, go back to chapter, at the beginning of chapter 6. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Midianite for 7 years, and the hand of the Midianite prevailed against Israel because the children of Israel made themselves dens and caves and strongholds. Remember, we talked about that with the thing. But what happened? And then go back up to verse where we were at in verse 25. What do we see here? Israel is in sin. What are they in sin to? Into the bondage because they're under Baal and because they're under the Ashtaroth. And so before anything happens, before Gideon can be used, before anybody can be used, what has to happen? The Baals have to be torn down. The Baals and the Ashtaroths and everything else. Now, think about this. Remember our chart where we were? We're before the kings of Israel, and before the kings come into play, before Saul gets anointed as the very first king of Israel. And of course we go through it to Solomon, and after Solomon what happens? We see the division in the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So we have, and really, I don't want to blame that, but it really was Solomon's fault that the split happened. But anyhow, that's neither here nor there, and a lesson for another day. But we see the split happening. We see the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom now splitting. And of course, what happens in the majority of those cases, particularly as you read Kings and Chronicles, when you go through them, what do we see? God gives them, says, listen, if you do what my word says and tear down those holy places that have been made to the Baals, mostly to Baal because that's who they were worshiping at the time, or the other temples that they had, if those get torn down, then everything is going to be okay. then everything's going to be all right. And see, so, because why? Because we can't serve two masters. We know Jesus says that, doesn't he? You can't serve two masters. It's impossible for us to do that. And because we can't serve two masters, there has to be this set before us. You can't have these two altars coexisting side by side. You see? And so the demand really is placed on Gideon was meant as a paradigm really for Israel, a change for Israel's thinking that I can worship God and Baal and the Ashtaroth. You see, you can't do both. And so as we see that, and particularly as we see that it's a sin that always besets Israel constantly. And particularly as we go forward into the era of the kings and we see the separation between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And of course the northern kingdom never destroyed any of the Baals or Asheroths or anything like that. They never destroyed any of the things. And so as a result, all their kings were evil. Every single king in the northern kingdom was evil. There's not one of them that you ever find that was good. Not one. And then you go in the southern kingdom and you find several that were good, but it was only because what? Because they destroyed the holy places. Or, in a couple of cases, you will hear that the king was good, and what laid him aside or what put his snare in his thing because he never tore down the holy places. He said, yes, he did right in the sight of the Lord, yet he never did what? And so, as a result, God did something because of that. You see? And it's interesting because you see how this all plays out. Not only from a historical standpoint, but also from a biblical standpoint, from a biblical theological standpoint about what God expects from us. You see, how he expects us to be in total service to him. See, Baal and Ashtaroth doesn't care if you're worshiping anybody else. But yet God, our God, is a jealous God because he says that he's a jealous God. And he says, what's he tell us in one of the commandments? That we're not to have any other gods before him. He says it very clearly. So Jesus tells us, listen, you can't serve two masters. Because you can't serve two masters, you have to understand that, and 1 Kings 18:21 says that there should be no limping between two opinions. There should be no limping between two opinions. And of course, Matthew 6:24, no one can be a slave for two masters. And so the same is for us, that we can't be the same. And so what has to happen? Sin in Israel has to be destroyed. It simply has to be destroyed. And because it has to be destroyed, somebody has to do it. And who's God asking to do it? He's asking Gideon to take care of it. And of course, where does Gideon start? In his own household. With his dad. And we see that and in verse 26, and build an altar to the Lord on top of the rock in the proper arrangement, and take the second bull and burn it, and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image in which you shall cut down. So Gideon took 10 men from among his servants and did as the Lord said to him. But because he was fearful, his father's household and the men of the city too much to do it by day, he did it by night. And again, what happened here? So what goes on here? Look at verse 28. And then the men of the city arose up early in the morning where there was the altar of Baal torn down, and the wooden image beside it was cut down, and the second bull was being offered on the altar which had been built. And so they said to one another, who has done this thing? And then when they had inquired and asked, they said, Gideon the son of Josiah has done this thing. Then look at verse 30. And then the men of the city said, now you can imagine what's going on here. The city council now is up in arms. Because now this altar has been torn down and another one has been built to Yahweh. And so the city's coming to Dad to try to take care of this. Bring out your son that he may die because he has torn down the altars of Baal and because he has cut down the offers of the image that was beside it. And again, that was the Ashtaroth that was beside it. And so, what does Josiah say here? But Josiah said to all who stood against him, would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning if he is God. Let him plead for himself because his altar has been torn down. You see, now, this kind of reminds you of Elijah, doesn't it? It doesn't remind you of Elijah as he's tormenting the prophets of Baal when they're up on Mount Carmel, and they've built now the two altars, or the two places where God is going to rain down fire upon it, and they're going to do all these things. It's kind of the same kind of thing that's going on here. And Josiah is saying, listen, if Baal is truly God, then what's going to happen? He will take care of it. You know? He'll take care of it. And so, because of it, he says, listen, he's got it. So we see that. And then, therefore, on the day he called him Jerubbabel, saying, let Baal plead against him because he has torn down his altar. In other words, telling him what? That let this happen. If Gideon is going to be put to death, Baal will take care of it. Don't you guys worry about it. And so then look at verse 33. Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites, the people of the east, gathered together, and they had crossed over the encampment of the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. Then he blew the trumpet, and the Abarites gathered behind him. And he sent messengers throughout Manasseh who gathered behind him. He also sent out messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they all went up to meet him. So now what's going on here? We see, before we get into the sign of the fleece here, that we see that he's calling everybody because now he's got word from the Lord. He sees the sign. He's gotten rid of sin in the camp, essentially. And so because he's gotten rid of the sin, he's destroyed the sin. What happens here? He's then calling everybody to go up to him. Now, again, the sign of the fleece here, he gets a little bit hesitant. Look at 36 and 37. So Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. Okay, again, you're putting the Lord to the test. So we see this again, that he does this. Now, what happens? Then the next sign comes to him. Then Gideon then asked God the next night to do the reverse things in 39 and 40. Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. you know, to me, that it's just, this is a holy God he's talking before. And yet, God is just so patient with him about what he keeps asking him. And so what's he say to him? He says, listen, he's going to ask him to do the opposite this time. Gideon challenges the reverse from weak faith and Gideon's challenge reveals his weak faith and confidence in the Lord, and we know that. We know that he has weak faith, and again, this avoidance thing comes up. I think that's why he lacks this confidence that he does, because he just wants to totally avoid this. Gideon did need signs to ascertain the will of God. The Lord clearly revealed his will. Now, let's just take a second here, because just a second here as we see this, because Gideon's constantly asking for a sign. Who else was also asking for a sign? Who was constantly asked for a sign during Jesus' day? Yeah. Yeah. Not his close disciples, but other disciples that were following him. Some of them may truly not know him, but the Pharisees and Sadducees and everybody were constantly asking for a sign. You know, they were constantly asking for signs. And God is doing this for him, but we know that what? It doesn't, what Jesus say about that? He says, listen, we're doing enough signs already that you should know about what's going on here. You know, you don't need us. Yeah. Well, just where was I reading? When I was reading the scripture today, where I was at, where he heals the guy's hand on the Sabbath. And you think, I mean, in my mindset, you think, but again, you're talking about these religious leaders of the day who are so enmeshed in tradition that they can't, that their religiosity is so in front of them that they can't see the forest through the trees, that this guy just got healed. Instead, they want to quibble about the Sabbath. You know, and in the passage I was reading, he said, "What? I'm the Lord of the Sabbath." So really, I can do anything I want. You know, it doesn't really make any difference what you say. I can do anything I want. You know, yes, I'm a Jew, but I can do anything I want because I'm Lord of the Sabbath. You know, but the thing about it is that they just didn't see it, and Gideon finally gets it, but it takes him a while to get it. You know, and then what happens here? Gideon sought signs because he wanted the Lord to demonstrate His power, and the Pharisees and Sadducees wanted to demonstrate His power too, but yet He was demonstrating His power all the time, and yet they didn't see it. You know, they never could clearly see it. And then, go ahead to the next one, Brian. Okay. Despite a clear revelation of God's will, Gideon twice pulls the Lord to the test, hoping to gain certainty for his faltering faith. Jesus said that to an evil, I guess I got ahead of myself when I did this. Jesus said to an evil and adulterous generation, look for a sign. You know, and even when Lazarus and his buddy die, and one goes to heaven and the other one goes to, it's Abram, isn't it? Lazarus and Abraham that go. And, you know, who's in hell? Abraham? Anyhow. Huh? The rich man, Lazarus. Yeah, he wasn't named, was he? He didn't have a name. Yeah, he wasn't named. Thank you. I'm glad you Bible scholars pulled me out of that. Good job. So those of you on TV, don't just disregard that. That's Abraham, but because it wasn't. But anyhow, the point is what is, you know, in relating that, he says what to them? He says, listen, the rich guy in hell says, listen, if you send them back a sign and show them, and he says, listen, they're not even going to get it. It doesn't make any difference what we do. They're still not going to get it. We've given them plenty of signs. We've given them plenty of times, and yet they still don't get it. You know, and when the Lord wishes to give us a sign, and we're arrogant enough to reject it, you know, then we've got issues and problems. And so the Lord is continually patient with us, showing us His mercy and grace, and that really comes down to it for us. And then look at the just kind of last thing there in verse 40. And God did so that night; it was dry, and the fleece. And again, He constantly does. He constantly shows him the sign that he needs to see for it. So here comes the application for us. Even the least in the kingdom are used of God. 1 Corinthians 12, 14 to 26. You know, even the least in His kingdom is used. And again, I think as you look throughout the biblical narrative and see these men and women of faith, and how even amongst their failures, even amongst their successes, and amongst everything that they did what? They were used by God. And they were just everyday people that essentially were used by God. They were called out for a specific purpose. And two, for us, in the Christian life, we too have to understand we have that same kind of calling to us as well. God blesses those who obey Him and who holds the blessings from those who are sinning, and withholds those blessings from those who are sinning. And again, we know that even as a Christian, if we're still in sin, if we're living in sin, if we're still constantly in sin, God is going to withhold blessings from us. God is going to take things from us. You know, He's going to do things for us, take things from us because we're living in that sin. And Deuteronomy chapter 28 to 30 demonstrates that. And then finally, idolatry is a bankrupt system of belief. And when I say that idolatry is a bankrupt system of belief, I'm talking about that for us too. Because we don't necessarily have the things, the Baals and the Ashtaroths, that are sitting on the dashboards of our car that we're worshiping as we're driving down the road. But we certainly have other things in our life that we worship, you know, that we hold in more esteem than God's Word. And so, you know, and so for us, the rubber meets the road, that we have to understand that there's a bankruptcy in that system for us. And because there's a bankruptcy in it, that can do nothing for us. And then we know that false gods can do nothing for us. We know that and that's why we've got to constantly turn to the Lord. Judges 6, 26 to 32, Psalm 115, and then Isaiah 44. And then finally, just a couple questions I want to leave you with here tonight. what are Gideon's objections to his service? What are his objections to his service? And again, we won't talk about these right now, but just these are things for you to think about. What is God's response in terms of his rejections? I think without saying too much or without even talking about it too much, we see God's patience, his care still being there. He could really just strike him down and say, listen, dude, I'm going to go find somebody else now. God had the power to do that, and yet he did. And he was very patient with Gideon in terms of all that he had, because he knows us, and he knows our inner heart, and he knows where we want to get to. And so because he knows all of that, sometimes it takes time for us to get there. And then why did Gideon tear down the altars? Because there can never be sin in the camp that resides with us. If we want the church to grow here, there can't be sin in here for the church to grow. If there's still sin among us, that needs to be gotten rid of and gotten out for us to take time to grow. And so we have to be weary of that as we push forward to understand the importance of dealing with sin. Sin will not allow, when sin is in the camp, sin causes others, even us as believers, to fall prey to a system that pulls us away from God. It gets us dealing with a lot of other things as opposed to necessarily dealing with what God wants us to do.